Well, welcome, friends. This is Pastor Rich Neal of St. Timothy Lutheran Church in Grand Island, New York. And I welcome you to part 4 of our series, Teach Us to Pray, in which we look at one well-known and classic style of prayer with scripture called Lectio Divina, and 4 different variations of that based on the 4 basic personality preferences according to the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator. The goal is to help us find a better way to pray with scripture in a way that's rewarding and fulfilling, and then to find a way to apply variations to that based on our own individual personality types so that it fits us much better and much more effectively. We are now looking at a style called Ignatian prayer. It's a style best suited for the SJ temperament. According to the Myers-Briggs terminology, that's the sensing, judging temperament. And we'll look at a way of praying with scripture that's sort of the opposite of one we looked at earlier, the one we began with, the Augustinian prayer. The SJ personality preference, the SJ temperament, is the one that really appreciates tie-in with the historical dimensions of the Christian faith. One that really looks at direct line connections between what was happening in the biblical days when scripture was experienced and written for the first time, and our day, today. It's important for the SJ temperament to employ the senses, sight, sound, hearing, taste, smell, and all those ways in which life comes at us through our senses. And then it's really important for the SJ personality or SJ temperament to apply some practical fruit from that experience with scripture, to harvest the fruit and make some practical application in daily life. The prayer type that we're using, the Ignatian prayer, is one that's built on that strength and that preference of the SJ temperament. And during this kind of prayer, we're actually going to be projecting ourselves back into the days, into the time and experience when the scripture was written for the first time. There are lots of ways to do that, but we're going to be using especially the 5 senses. We'll be reading scripture with our senses, a sense of smell and sense of taste, sense of feeling, touch, sense of sight, and sense of hearing. So in order to do that, it's more helpful perhaps to choose passages of scripture that have some action element to them. Stories from the gospel, for example, are good places to start and use that. Or stories from Acts of the Apostles, for example, where there are a cast of characters and some action involved in the scripture. And as with any of these variations on Lectio Divina, the first thing to do is really read the scripture through several times until you get it in your head and in your heart, and you know the action so you can play through it in your mind without having to rely too much on reading the word again. Once you've done that, then for the SJ temperament, you'll want to project yourself back into the scene and ask yourself some questions about your observation. What do you see going on in that scene? If you were present at that time, what are you tasting or smelling or hearing in the surroundings? What does the air feel like? What are the smell of the dust in the streets, the sound and the bustle of people around, so that you really experience being there in your imagination. And then once you're there, run through the events of the passage. Let the story unfold in your imagination so that you experience it during the course of action. I'll give you an example. I'll read for you a passage of scripture from the 10th chapter of Luke's Gospel, verses 38 to 42. And then we'll ask some questions about it. We'll observe our experience about being in this scene. The scene is a familiar one, I believe. It's one where Jesus comes to dinner with Mary and Martha, and what unfolds around that dinner table. So here's the passage, Luke 10:38 to 42. Now, as they went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." So in your imagination, praying with the Ignatian style with the scripture, you would imagine yourself perhaps seated at the table for dinner that evening. Or maybe you go into the scene at the early part where Martha and Mary may be in town, and you hear that Jesus has been invited and is planning to come. And you process that news and you ask perhaps to be invited to dinner. And then at the dinner table, you imagine the sounds, the food you're eating, the sounds of conversation around the table, sounds coming from the kitchen and from the street outside, the smell of the meal on the table, and especially the dinner conversation among the people at the table. You might also then imagine the conversation between Mary and Martha that leads up to this question that Martha has with Jesus. And you might listen for Jesus' response, more than just the words of the scripture. You might see his physical response to the question and his affect, his facial expressions. And then you might hear Martha's conversation back to him after he tells her what he does in the scripture. And perhaps you enter into some of that conversation and you talk with some dinner guests about what you've observed in this interaction between this guest and the hosts. As you do that, just take your time with it and notice how you're feeling and what you're hearing inside as you experience that. And then when you're finished, you draw your prayer with scripture to a close by letting yourself rest in that experience and reap whatever fruit you can. And then begin to apply that fruit. Ask if you take some lesson from that, some instruction that you hear from God as you go through that scripture, some insight that you may be able to share with others. And then process that in some way, perhaps with journaling, maybe in conversation with a friend or somebody else in a prayer meeting with you, to let that process you even further. That's essentially the process of Ignatian prayer. I posted on our website a written description of what I've just gone through, along with a couple of examples that you might use to get started. I've also posted there a brief description, a thumbnail sketch of the SJ temperament, so you might get a better sense of what that temperament is like, and you might find some affinity with that. If you haven't taken the Myers-Briggs indicator, you might simply be able to read the description and find yourself nodding that, yes, that's you, or no, that's not you. Have some blessing with that scripture as you read through it, and use this style of prayer for the week ahead. We'll be gathering again. If you're joining us for the first time through with this series, we'll be gathering on Wednesday at 7:00 on Zoom to talk about your experiences, to raise questions or observations about the experience. So there it is. Blessings to you. The SJ temperament in the series Teach Us to Prayer. We'll see you next week for our final session, when we'll look at one more type of prayer, one more variation for the basic Lectio Divina style of prayer. Have a blessed day.